Hello and welcome to episode 245 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, I think we're going to take one last look at our power rankings in the regular season, and we might do it one final time before champs in a few weeks. But I think there's been quite a bit of movement, at least compared to what we probably thought. When we did this before the major four qualifiers. So we'll take one last look before also the final week of online Call of Duty, which is always a time to celebrate. It's always a time to kind of look back on the season and wonder why we did this to ourselves. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, one final week of online matches, and then that portion of the season is all done and dusted. Not a ton on the news front to really talk about this week, other than the previewing the matches. So we're gonna try and do some filler stuff here at the start, but I'm anticipating this being one of our shorter episodes, which means we'll somehow find 2 hours to yap about.
Yeah, I'm sure this will be our longest episode yet. I think let's start with the power rankings, and then we could because of some of this other stuff we might touch on, we might not. But the power rankings are interesting because, again, like I said before, we did before the major four qualifiers, we did our power rankings, and I don't know how confident you feel in your power rankings when you do them. I felt like maybe like 90% there. There were, especially in the middle, I talked about it on the show, where Toronto and where like Paris, possibly where the Falcons and G2 and Miami, like those teams that are kind of like middle to the top, like Toronto, I felt okay, like maybe I could move those around. Maybe that's not as solid as maybe I had previously thought. But now we've had, obviously, roster changes, and the conversation around Toronto, around Paris, Miami has obviously made their roster change. G2 have made their roster change. A lot of things, I think, have actually shifted in a short amount of time, and yet we haven't seen any LAN matches since that time either. So that also plays, I think, with our heads when we talk about these things. But I do think it's good to revisit it and kind of see where we stand now that we're going into this final week of online Call of Duty. I don't think that there's really much change, if at all, with those bottom four teams. I think that those teams kind of stay where they are, and that's Cloud9, Boston, Vancouver, and Carolina. You could make an argument that I don't think there's any movement with Vancouver and C9 specifically, because those two teams are the two worst teams seemingly at this point. But would Toronto potentially, could they slide down into that Carolina and Boston, especially Boston is, they're already guaranteed a winner's bracket spot. Carolina very nearly went 2-0 last week with some big upset wins, or they got one, almost a second. Where does kind of Toronto fit into that area? Should they be where Carolina and Boston are currently, or is that being overly pessimistic for the Koi at this point?
Well, they just lost to Boston a couple days ago, so I had to put Boston ahead of Toronto in my power rankings. Boston is off to a winner's bracket start for the first time this season, so I thought they at least deserved a little bit of a bump up, but I still, obviously they're not going to be the champs, and I said it last episode, I'm pretty sure they most likely, at least from an outsider's perspective, they should be treating Major 4 as their champs and just going as hard as possible, because it's their last tournament before EWC. They can cause some chaos, maybe get a decent placing, get a better payday, and it's similar to what we saw from the Seattle Surge at the end of Cold War, when they shocked the world and Nikki D dropped like 15 on standoff S&D Game 5 to knock out Atlanta FaZe with like a top 6 placing or something like that. So yeah, that's I think like I said last week with Toronto, it was really the combination of them losing to Boston plus how the match went against Cloud9. Like if they 3-0 smoked Cloud9, I think that would have like, you know, I wouldn't have be as pessimistic about Toronto, but it's the combination of the loss to Boston and the fact that it went all the way to a game 5 against Cloud9 that's really sticking out to me right now for them. And I think, most notably, the last time we did our power rankings, Joe was still on Toronto, right? So this was all um, I put the note or the date in the notes, and I scrolled down. May 28th was when we did our power rankings. It was episode 239. If anyone wants to go back and check it out, that was before any of the major four matches started. So it was before any of these changes that happened right before the second minor tournament of the season. And I I think Toronto is obviously taking a hit without Joe, and it showed in this past week.
Yeah, I when I did these power rankings, yeah, we could just kind of go tier by tier and discuss it at that point. But I thought that we should start with Toronto because they've taken the biggest dip and they've, I just don't believe in them anymore. And that's kind of where, or that's how my power rankings reflect it as well. I have them in the very, very bottom tier. It's a 5-team tier: Toronto, Carolina, Vancouver, Boston, and C9. I have them all just together, and it's no shot because, I think I said it when we did our power rankings last time that I said, like, there's like, you could talk me into any of the 8 teams that were, we thought were going to champs. You could talk me into any of them winning champs. It would be a little bit harder to convince me that like Miami or G2 in that form were going to go to champs and win. But I was like, I could see Toronto, who I certainly didn't believe were like a top 3 team, but they had obviously gotten 3rd place and they had been able to compete very well with some of these top teams. Paris, obviously, you could convince me of it. The Falcons, despite all of their woes, you could convince me. And then you had like those top 4 teams that had all won something or been very close to winning something. So, again, 3-4 weeks ago, you could have easily convinced me that any of those 8 teams could win champs. And now I think that list is down to 7. I'm still not entirely convinced of Miami, not really convinced of G2, but like I think the very best versions of those teams could certainly make a run and certainly could win a championship, like if everything went right. But I just don't believe Toronto is in that category anymore. So I have them at the very, very bottom. That is, again, I think the last few episodes we've talked about it is just like kind of ridiculous that has come to pass, that Toronto, a team that has gotten 3rd at 2 consecutive majors and had one of the best players in the league on their team until 2 weeks ago, and Kleenex is obviously like perennially like a top, a top 10, top 15 player every single season. And now you could really make the argument like if Carolina or Boston, probably not Boston, like just in general, but again, like you said, Boston did beat Toronto. I don't know how like sustainable that is, but like if the records were the same and like every one of these teams had a shot to actually make champs now, like you could make a solid argument that like Carolina or Boston might go further at champs than Toronto would, despite how well Toronto has done for most of this season. So again, just kind of ridiculous, but that that's why I have them at the very bottom. The other 2 teams that I'm not entirely convinced on, and that's Miami and G2. Where do you kind of slot them in? Because like I said, both of these teams also made roster changes. Miami, I think it was kind of baked in when we did our power rankings, and we figured that Real would be coming into the roster. We just didn't know exactly for who he would be coming into the roster. And then obviously G2 makes their 2 roster changes as part of the Estriel move, and then Mamba goes out. You have Envoy and Nasty come in, and we haven't really seen too much of them since then, but obviously we have seen some. Where do those teams kind of fall in your power rankings now that you've got to see just a few matches? They were in the minor. how do you feel about G2 and the Heretics after a few weeks now?
Yeah, with Miami, I still think, I need to see a little bit more from them because they had that lackluster first showing at the minor tournament where they lost to Vancouver. Um, Obviously they did just pick up a win against FaZe, so that speaks for itself. They have had success against FaZe, uh, all season, regardless of the roster, but I'm trying to look here. They might have been on a 5-match losing streak before this FaZe win, counting the major and the minor and how everything lined up. I think that should be right. But obviously different rosters thrown in there as well. So I still need to see more from Miami. I think it obviously, like I said, with them getting first rounded during the minor tournament, we didn't see as much of them as we thought, even though it was potentially only one more match. That still would have been, better than just seeing them get 3-0 slammed. I'm pretty sure it was a 3-0 against Vancouver. So yeah, it was a 3-0. So yeah, still want to see more from Miami. G2, I mean, I'm kind of in that spot where like I think they should be better than they have been earlier in the season, especially with the way Envoy's been playing and the way Kremp's been playing overall. But really, Envoy, since the MPC switch and even since he's come over to this team, I think he's really, uh, performed better in my eyes. And I think I just need to see a little bit more from them as well. I think there is a good match coming up this week that we'll obviously get into. That should be a good test for G2, but I still think that like for whatever I really hope it's not like past years or previous experiences clouding my judgment or whatever with Minnesota, but I get that feeling every time with them that it's like, I could pick them to win a match and they're gonna get slammed, and then I pick against them and they pull off some crazy 3-0 upset, and it's like I just don't have a great read on them, I guess. I don't know if that's the nature of Call of Duty nowadays or the nature of the team or what the case may be, but yeah, for me, I had I did the bottom of my power rankings. I was gonna put Carolina, Vancouver, and Cloud9 in the same tier, and I just couldn't do it. I mean, I was listening to the LAT did a podcast last night. They dropped, and I watched that to see if there was anything they said that was juicy that we could maybe talk about. And they even, I think it was a Beezy who said it in that. He was like, Cloud9's a top 32 challengers team. There's 11 pro teams and then Cloud9. And I was like, yeah, so if that's how the other teams are viewing them, I can't put anybody with Cloud9 rightfully in power rankings. So that's why I got Cloud9 on their own. Then I did a new E tier for Carolina and Vancouver on their own. And then in the D tier, I put Boston at the top just because of their success in these recent qualifiers. I had Boston, Toronto, and Miami in D tier right now. So the tier above that, I had Falcons and G2 just because I think Minnesota is better than all of those teams that I listed, especially right now. But again, it's a situation where I think the middle of the rankings is perfect for G2 because I think they should beat the teams below them, but they might lose to them. And then they probably lose to the teams above them, but they might beat them. So I think that's a good place to have Minnesota, at least in my eyes. But that's, it is what it is.
Well, yeah, that would make them kind of like top 6 at this point in the season. And that makes sense because, they are kind of in that 6 through 8 zone with both Toronto and Miami. But I think we both agree like Toronto and Miami are like, especially Toronto now, like that are probably closer to the 8. Miami, who knows how that'll actually go?
Yeah.
Like we just saw them beat FaZe, but like at the same point, they beat FaZe without Real before, so it doesn't really mean as much, which seems really stupid just to say that like beating FaZe doesn't mean anything, but like I mean they've beaten them like 4 times this season, so and then we've seen them play other top teams and just have no shot at beating them. So yeah, I kind of agree with that. Where I had those two teams, I had them in the same tier together. That's where I had them actually when we did the last power rankings. So like before I had those bottom 4 teams, they were all on a tier by themselves, and then I had Miami and G2 together, and it was no, because I think it was a lot worse, a lot more pessimistic about them at that point just a few weeks ago. But I have them still in the second to bottom tier together, and I said only if I'm a billionaire, meaning that I would only bet on those 2 teams if I had just so much disposable income that it didn't even matter, that I'd probably be wasting all that money. But I truly believe like they do have a shot. Like I maintain like the top 7 teams, with varying degrees of difficulty, I guess, or varying lengths of conversation. I could be talked into it, but these 2 teams are certainly like on the bottom of that list. Miami is probably a little bit more difficult for me to be talked into, like I've said, because like I just don't. If this was last season, certainly it could be a lot easier of a thought of experiment. But I saw what happened at the minor, which again, they played Vancouver, and it was like they got swept, and that's gonna stick with me for a little bit because Vancouver is not a very good team, and we haven't really got to see them much since. But they certainly could surprise me, this week, or if they do it at Major 4, then that would actually mean something because we've seen them play well online. That's not something that we're unaccustomed to. It's on LAN where they've really, really struggled. So they're going to have to prove on LAN that they can do something. Whereas G2, I think, is like a lot more of it's a lot easier, to believe that they'll actually go and win something. But, like you said, like Envoy has played really, really well, and Nasty is certainly like an upgrade for this roster. But we've also been burned by G2 before, so it makes sense why we'd have some skepticism about like where they potentially could be when Champs comes, and we're talking about like who actually will win these events. But I feel like even though they're the second to bottom tier, I think there's reason to be optimistic if you're fans of either one of these 2 teams, where there probably wasn't a lot of reasons like 4 weeks ago when we were talking about these same 2 teams. Next, I would like to talk about where you potentially have the Paris Gentlemates, because when we did the last power rankings, I had Paris in the right in the middle. I had them in my 3rd tier of 5. They were part of the probably not group, which was Toronto, Paris, and the Falcons. And I had them right in the middle because I was like, Toronto is probably the top of that tier, because we've actually seen them recently on LAN be able to do something. And then I had them a little bit ahead of the Falcons because the Falcons have really only done something at Major 3 and otherwise been like really up and down, even more inconsistent than Paris has been. Where do you fall with Paris now? We know that Joe Deceives and Estriel on this roster is like seemingly a massive upgrade to this team, like talent-wise, and maybe even more importantly, like a reset mentally for a team that, reportedly or purportedly was kind of in disarray after a loss on LAN. So is Paris higher, lower, just the same where you had them the last time?
I got them higher, and I think I have them technically in 4th if you like counted it out, but I put them in B tier with FaZe. I couldn't put them above FaZe because FaZe just beat them, and I know it's just one online match, but so that's how I got them as my 2nd team in the B tier with FaZe, and I think I feel pretty good about that placing for them right now, just because I think they are better than every other team below that, and it's just a question of what they can do against LAT, OpTic, and FaZe. I mean, I guess they've had some trouble with the Falcons because that was seemingly like the what's the saying, like the straw that broke the camel's back or whatever. But that's a different roster now, and I still maybe I'm a little higher on this team than some people, but I think 4th is like a decent spot for them to be in, and I did, previously I had Toronto in 4th, which obviously that's changed drastically since Um, the last time we did the power rankings, and I had Toronto alone in B tier, and then I had Gentlemates as the top of C tier with Falcons, G2, and Miami. So it's really only a slight bump up
Mm-hmm.
in like total, but I still think this team is significantly better than the recent form we've seen from Gentlemates. Obviously, it's hard to say they are like in totality better than the Gentlemates roster that won Major One, just because that is still a major winning roster at the end of the day, despite all this other stuff going on behind the scenes and the struggles online, yada yada. But until I see them play on land, I don't think I can put them any higher than where I got them right now.
I think with me, it is not necessarily that I have seen anything crazy from Paris uh, in like the 2 or 3 weeks that we've gotten to see this new roster. It's that I haven't been disappointed by them the same way that like the past iteration of the Gentlemates had disappointed me recently, like, you know, post Major One, of course. And I think that's the only reason that I too have kind of like been maybe a little more of a believer. I had them, like I said, kind of, you know, technically they would be fourth, or excuse me, fifth, where I had them. And they're fourth now, and that is like you. Basically, we bumped them up one spot in the power rankings, like in terms of the total, and that's because of Toronto. Toronto and like Paris didn't do anything
Yeah.
other than pay Toronto money
Take
to kind of
Toronto.
go down, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, I have Paris in that third tier. They are still in the middle of the third tier, the exact same place that they were for me previously. It's just that now the teams around them have changed a little bit. I have them in the third tier, and I put that as roll of the dice, and that's FaZe Vegas, Paris Gentlemates, and the Riyadh Falcons. And I would like to actually kind of loop in the Falcons, especially with this conversation, because I have a hard time kind of coming to terms that the Falcons could be something more than what they have been this season, which was I was the complete opposite way earlier in the season. Like when the year started, I believe I was like, hey, like the Falcons, like this is a pretty good roster. You know, I'm not really sold on Exnid, but these other three guys are proven winners. All of them literally won champs at some point in their careers and were like some of the best players in the league at some points. And it was a complete disaster if you were expecting the Falcons to be anything significant or anything important throughout most of this season. And recently, that has begun to change. They have been a lot more consistent, a lot better, at least, you know, in the matches that they played. I don't know if you could actually say that they're any more of a championship contender, but like along the same lines of Paris, like it does seem like there might be a little bit of a shift in reputation and belief for a team like this. Where do you kind of put the Falcons, and do you kind of see them the same way as like or as Gentlemates, that like I don't know if I can believe fully, but I really want to believe for both of those teams.
I think Gentlemates, like I would believe in them more than Falcons right now, and even despite like Falcons are 3-0 in these qualifiers, but I went on a tiny bit of a mini tangent
Yeah.
last episode on that one overload map, and I get that's just one map and the over hundreds that this roster has played together, but I think that's still like just something that's like I there shouldn't be a situation against any team unless they're just getting giga slammed by one of the top teams where Kismet is the only player neutral and then everybody else is negative on Falcons. I get bad maps happen. It is bound to happen, but especially I think that was against Carolina, I believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That did that against Carolina, I think was the bigger issue for me
Yeah.
that it happened. But regardless of that, I still just like you said, there have been flickers of hope for this Falcons team at different moments. I mean, even like earlier this year, they started out. I think they started 0-2 in both of the Major One and Major Two qualifiers, and then went on decent runs to get like a pretty good seeding at both of those tournaments. And then they actually had like their best showing, I think, on land during the Pro Am at Major Three. So you know, I still obviously I think very highly of Cell as a player. Pred's nasty. and love the Bulldog. It's just like, and you know, you could even argue Xnid's been their best player for portions of this season, but it's like there's just something that hasn't clicked for them, for me at least, where like I can put them like on the same pedigree as the teams I have in the top four, right? Which is LAT, OpTic, FaZe, and Gentlemaids right now. So for me, I had them at the top of C tier, which I ended up doing 7 tiers. Is that 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. So but they're in fifth because I did LAT alone, OpTic alone in A tier, LAT alone in S tier, then FaZe and Gentlemates in B tier, and then Falcons at the top of C tier. So I mean that's kind of where I view them right now, is like they're that quote unquote gatekeeper or whatever to the top teams, and they've had success against Gentlemates with the previous iteration, so they could be pushing into that upper echelon with a good performance at Major 4, but I'm still going to need to see that quote-unquote performance before I can, put them any higher.
Yeah, I think it's just actually seeing them win matches consistently as kind of that's been the way that I've come around a little bit. I'm not fully there. I just can't be because with the great. I honestly think they could have finished top 3 at Major 3, but they ran into the wrong teams at the wrong time. Like I think their 2 losses were to OpTic and LAT, and that's just unfortunate. That's just kind of how the bracket shakes out. But like if the bracket was more favorable to them, I certainly think that they could have beaten Toronto and beaten FaZe again. Like I think they beat them in the groups, but they didn't see them in the brackets. But I think they certainly could have. So like there's the optimism there. I think they're 11-4 in their last 15 matches, which dates back to late April. If you want to be pessimistic about it, you would say that I think like 5 of those or 6 of those wins are against like the bottom 4 teams. So like, they beat again in that that span dating back to the first minor of the season. They beat Vancouver twice. They beat Miami. They beat Cloud9 twice. They beat Miami again. So that's 2 wins against Miami. And then they beat Carolina twice. So like, of those 11 wins, you could say, just excluding Miami because that's a little bit disrespectful, but that's still like 5-6 wins against like bottom 4 teams. But if you want to be more optimistic, they've beaten Paris twice in that span, both 3-0s. They beat FaZe, obviously, in the groups. That was also a 3-0. And then, how highly you think of Miami, you could say, hey, they've beaten them twice as well. But, like they haven't beaten OpTic, they haven't beaten LAT. A lot of teams haven't, so I don't want to hold that against them. But I certainly feel better about them going into we're not into Major 4 yet, but and maybe they'll screw it up this weekend, which would certainly be fitting. But right now, I feel a lot better about the Falcons, and it's not like I put them any higher. Like I didn't want to put them over FaZe because I've actually seen FaZe on LAN consistently be one of the top teams, and I've seen the peak of FaZe much higher, in the ceiling much higher than that of the Falcons. But yeah, I just felt like, hey, like Toronto was kind of a, obviously like, and that's kind of in the discussion with all of these teams is like Toronto fell down and none of these teams screwed it up so much that I didn't feel like I could put them over Koi or one of those bottom 4 teams. So that's kind of where I have Falcons, and I do feel pretty similar about the Gentlemates, even though like, I don't think it can be argued, but like the Falcons have played much better than the Gentlemates recently. It's just like we saw what the Gentlemates were capable of at Major 4, and Joe Deceives is, proven to be much better than any of the Gentlemates guys, or excuse me, any of the Falcons guys to this point in this season, in this game. But, like remains to be seen what either of these 2 teams will do with all of the talent that they have. Another team that has a lot of talent, and I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do with it, is FaZe. and I have them in that tier. Like I said, they're in the roll of the dice. I have them at the top because, again, I saw what they're able to do when 04 is cooking and when everybody's clicking. Like, this is almost an unbeatable team in some respects, but that has been very, very rare to see. He had one really great land performance. Simp, like you mentioned, I think on the last show, maybe it was 2 shows ago, like, recently has not been that great for Simp, and like he's had a few stinkers, which again, it's online, you don't know, like, especially with where teams are in relation to each other. Maybe that's just he's kind of been a victim of online Call of Duty, but it can't be ignored that FaZe has not looked super great, and even at Major 3, them losing the Falcons was like, all right, like, what the hell happened there? And I think that there is understandable skepticism about where FaZe Vegas is at this point in the season. I think there was skepticism before they even won a major because, like, they looked fine. I think they went like maybe 5-2 or 4-3 or something in those Major 1 qualifiers. And they looked fine at Major 1, but like, we just expect a lot of FaZe, and when they don't deliver a lot, then I think it's kind of like just a burden of high expectations. Where do you place FaZe right now? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think we both had them like in our top 3 essentially in the last power rankings. Where do you have them now?
Same spot. I got them at the top of B tier. Like I said, I got them in Gentlemates in B tier, and we saw FaZe beat Gentlemates, so I had to put FaZe above Gentlemates because of that. But yeah, I mean, I feel like a broken record at this point talking about out FaZe, at least in the online portion. It seems like there's some stuff going on with them in the online matches. You mentioned the Simp stuff. We've talked about that enough at this point. It's just I am trying to not put too much stock into the online stuff when it comes to FaZe and their performance because of what I've seen them do on land, but it is at the same time, their success came during the Dravic meta, and it doesn't seem like they have found that same success during this NPC meta for whatever reason. So that is what I'm going to try to pay more attention to for FaZe moving forward, is like how it feels like 04 and Simp are performing with the NPC, and maybe it's an issue with, like, not there are some maps now where a lot of people are just trying to use 3 NPCs, and maybe it's a case of like Draza is not as comfortable with the NPC either. I don't know, that's just an example there. I'm not saying that's the case, but it's like other teams have that like guy, the third guy, where it's like you give him the NPC and they're gonna be fine. And I'm not saying Draza has been a solid flex in his career before, but I just haven't been paying enough attention to his individual performances to know, like, how he's been doing with the NPC versus when he's got the AR in his hand. So I'm gonna try to pay a little more attention to that during their upcoming matches, and we'll have to see. But I do think it's like a whatever the opposite of a perfect storm would be for someone. This is just like a bad storm for FaZe, with the combination of the online issues that are seemingly happening, meta change after they win an event, and all that, like, perfectly brewing into this storm that's like got us doubting one of the best Call of Duty players of all time and his team right now.
I think it's interesting because I'm in the same boat, that they're still like technically like the 3rd best team in the league for me, as is the case with you. But for both of us, we have made them the top team in the 3rd tier, and where they were in the 2nd tier for both of us in the last power rankings. And again, that's kind of a consequence of LAT and OpTic at the top, and like where they are in relation to each other. But like it's I think it's telling a little bit that like neither one of us were like, yeah, they're like in that same tier with OpTic. And because I mean, I wasn't there a few weeks ago. You weren't there a few weeks ago because you had OpTic in that top tier with LAT. And now we're both like, yeah, FaZe is a good 3rd tier kind of team, and like the best of the 3rd tier, but still 3rd tier. And I think that's like pretty telling of like where FaZe is and how they just haven't given us any reason to believe that they're like the team that they were back at Major 2. And I mean, they didn't give us like a ton of good reasons before Major 2, and they haven't given us a lot of good reasons since Major 2. But like, again, it is just like an interesting development that they have been like not like super inconsistent, but like they haven't shown a top level in a while. Like anytime that they played a top team, they've typically come up short, and then they play Miami like, you know, every week it seems, and they lose, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense as to where they are. But you know, like the talent is there, and we've seen them put it together this season. But I just don't, I can't trust them nearly as much as I want to, based on the talent and based on the pedigree, and you know, them winning a championship, whatever that was 2 months ago. To me, that's just kind of crazy, but that's kind of where we are with FaZe Vegas at this point in the season. And of course, that means with FaZe being in the third tier for both of us and being the top team of that third tier, that means that we have 2 tiers above, and I think we're in agreement on how to rank both of those teams, and that's LAT at the very top and OpTic in a second tier by themselves. How did you come to that decision? Because you, in the last power rankings, had OpTic and LAT in the top tier, in the S tier, and then you had FaZe in that A tier. What made it so you dropped OpTic back down into that second tier?
I think really it's just a consequence of this past week for OpTic, and you know, I that is kind of hypocritical of me in the sense of, you know, not trying to put too much stock into the online matches for some of these top teams. But at the same time, I think it's just pretty clear to me right now, especially with LAT beating OpTic in recent times at least, that LAT just is playing like a better team than OpTic right now. I still think
Definitely.
OpTic has had, you know, probably a more consistent season. I think that is safe to say because of all the second place finishes, but you know, they haven't gotten one across the finish line yet, and LAT did at the most recent event, and LAT, you know, they're 3-0 in these qualifiers. OpTic's 2-2 with the 2 Game 5 losses of late. So I still think highly of OpTic, but I just bumped them down in a sense because I think LAT is playing like the best team in the game right now, and I do think, you know, that could be slightly hypocritical, like I said, because of, you know, it's not like I'm bumping down OpTic 5 spots though because of 2 Game 5 losses or anything like that. But I think Octane had a pretty funny comment during the last Breaking Point episode there where he called OpTic Neslo terrorists, and I thought that was just like one of the funniest ways to describe what OpTic had been going through lately. He said their hard point is clean, their S&D and overload. I think they're so far in their own head at this point. And yeah, I think there are questions over what exactly has been going on with OpTic throughout this season, and we have never had like a really solid answer because it has been seemingly like something different at each point where they get to these finals, and then like in one case they're losing the S&Ds, and then the next time they get to the finals they're losing, you know, the overloads or whatever the case may be. I can't remember them all now at this point, but it felt like there was always something different going on. Whereas right now it seems like that, especially they had an 0-4 week in S&D, and we talked about that last episode where it's like maybe they're trying out some maps and stuff like that. So again, don't want to not going too crazy here, but I do think LAT is just playing like a slightly better team than OpTic right now, and that's why I got them separated 1 and 2.
Well, yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I don't find it hypocritical for me, at least. I know that you have been like pretty suspect, to say the least, about online performances, and I get that entirely. I'm just subject to like, you know, letting the online, but I submit myself to the online results, and I do take them more into account because I just because I believe it the other way. I believe like even the teams that do well online, typically like this season has been a lot worse in that regard than past years. But like I go back to like years and years ago when the E United were called like Online Warriors and IW, and then they went to Atlanta and they actually won the event. And I was like, yeah, because they played really well online. Like that makes me believe that like maybe you're not as good. Maybe you're not like 100% of what you are online or on LAN as you are online. But like, even if you're 90% and you're winning all those matches online, that means like you're going to be pretty damn good when you get on LAN. And I've always kind of felt like that. And again, this season has not been very good for that theory. And it's worked the opposite way. For a lot of teams that, like FaZe has not been like great online, like especially compared to past years, but on LAN they've been pretty good. We saw OpTic, kind of dip during the Major 1 qualifiers, and then they had a really great Major 1 until the finals. And we've seen stuff like that that's not too crazy to think about. But with OpTic, like, yeah, they just went 0-2, and they didn't play like particularly great teams in both of those matches, and especially like compared to them, because OpTic had been very consistent. Like they had by far the best record in the Major 2 qualifiers. They're very strong in the Major 3 qualifiers. We saw them just be dominant in each of the 3 majors up until the grand finals. So there was always a reason to believe that they were just like the most consistent team. And then for whatever reason in those big moments would come up short. And one of those was like a game 7 loss. And you can really make an argument like it could have went either way. I think they were up 3-2 in that grand final series against LAT in Major 3, and then they lose. And, you can make the criticisms, of course, but I just wasn't ready to be like, well, certainly LAT is better than OpTic at that point in the season. I feel a little bit differently now, coming off this 0-2 week, coming off of, I now think it's 3 consecutive losses to LAT, dating back to like Minor 1 or something like that, which I just don't think can be ignored when you pair it with what LAT has been doing recently. And I think we talked about it on last episode. I think they've won 11 straight matches, the Thieves have, and 13 of their last 14. And that includes, Minor 2, that includes Major 3, that, is really just, or I think both of the minors and Major 3. And so, like, that's just not something that I am ready to ignore. And that, again, that doesn't really mean anything when we're talking about OpTic, because, like, we both have them as the second best team. And it's not like we bump them down to the no shot tier or something, like where it's like, all right, they're dead in the water. But, there is, I think, reason to just be a little more cautious with OpTic. If they went 2-0 last week, maybe I think I would have them in this top tier. But when you lose to Carolina, it's like an automatic red flag goes up, and it's like, all right, something's going on here. We don't know what it is. And then you pair it with another loss. And, again, it's only 2 losses. They still have by and far the best record in the league. But we have to take these things into account. And I still very well may pick OpTic when we get to the Major 4 preview show. I might be like, yeah, I just think that they're still, they got it in them. Maybe they have a better setup for the bracket than LAT does. Or we could see some vulnerability from LAT. We nearly saw them lose, I think, 2 matches this weekend. But at this point, if LAT just keeps winning, if any other team did that, like, I think we would both be like, yeah, like we have to see them lose before we can start picking against them again. And we'd have to see OpTic start beating LAT and start, that would be a big thing if they were able to beat the Thieves. But OpTic is technically on a 3-match losing streak because they lost in the Minor 2 grand finals to LAT. Then they lost to Minnesota. Then they lost to Carolina. So I believe it is 3 straight losses to LAT. The last time that they beat them was in the Major 2 qualifiers. Since then, they lost in Minor 1 to the Thieves. That was a 3-2 loss. Then they lost, of course, in the Major 3 grand finals. That was a 4-3 loss. And then Minor 2 grand finals, which was a 4-2 loss. So very competitive series. I don't want to get that mixed up, but I think there are very good reasons why we would both have LA Thieves over OpTic at this point. I do just want to quickly run them down just to make sure,
Yeah.
because we obviously were talking more, beat by beat, step by step. But for you, the power ranking is as follows. You have the S tier, which is the LA Thieves. You have the A tier, that's OpTic Texas. B tier, FaZe Vegas and the Paris Gentlemates. C tier, Riyadh Falcons and G2 Minnesota. D tier, Boston Breach, Toronto Koi, and the Miami Heretics. E tier, which is the Carolina Royal Ravens and Vancouver Surge, and then F tier is C9 New York. Pretty similar for me. I have the top tier, which is LA Thieves. I have that as streakers. I could not think of a good one to label them with. I use the same tier name for OpTic Texas that I did the last one, which was Silver Surfers, quote, for now. So I still think that, they still have a shot, and I definitely think they could break that streak at Major 4. Then I had my third tier, which is Roll of the Dice, FaZe Vegas, Paris Gentlemates, Riyadh Falcons. Only If I'm a Billionaire is my fourth tier, which is Miami Heretics and G2 Minnesota. And then the no shot tier is Toronto Koi, Carolina Royal Ravens, Vancouver Surge, Boston Breach, and C9 New York. Any last thoughts on the power rankings and kind of how you're feeling about the league in general, I guess, going into this final week of online Call of Duty?
No, I think kind of set the stage here for these final matches. I think honestly, before we started recording today, I was gonna try and say like maybe we could do like a mini bracket preview of what we think the bracket is gonna look like, but so much shit happens in the final week that like we're looking at this right now with Falcons at 3-0, Breach 3-1, Minnesota 3-2. Like some of these teams have multiple games still to be played, and I think it's gonna look drastically different than it does right now. So yeah, I mean, this was probably like it's a weird time to do power rankings, like right in the middle of qualifiers or right before the qualifiers end, before a tournament or whatever. But I think it was important, at least, especially given the fact that there were roster changes and major roster changes since the last time we did them. So I think pretty happy with where we've landed right now. But like you said, a lot can change over, not only this next week, but obviously following Major 4 as well.
Yeah, we typically don't get a Toronto, Paris type move, G2, like three teams that, really just shake up the league in terms of basically that one roster change, which was Joe. Like, I don't know if that's really ever happened in the CDL era. Maybe it happened back in the day in like CWL or like the MLG eras, but like I don't remember like someone being like, yeah, let's blow it up in like July.
Well, honestly, I think that I was thinking it at the time was the comparison when it was thought that this could be a trade for Joe to Neptune was the gunless trade to FaZe during IW. Like that was like the only quote unquote trade that I could think of, and then this was apparently going to be a trade, but obviously that didn't happen. But like in terms of a mid-season roster move, like Gunless was one of the best players in the game at that time, and then he was like benching himself and forced his way seemingly onto FaZe, and that led to Clay going to United, and that was a whole saga on its own. But like, yeah, I would say this is definitely the biggest roster change, mid-season roster change since that. I guess you could count Merc last year, but that was like, I think you would have to go with Merc actually, but I think it's a little weird because, like I said, it was initially seeming like it could have been a trade, and if it was a trade, I think that would be more comparable to Gunless. But if you do compare it to Merc, that is 2 consecutive years where there have been major roster changes before the last event of the last regular season event of the season.
Yeah, and I think I think this is more comparable to the Gunless and Clayster trade because that was like a huge risk for those teams because they were near the top of the league. Whereas OpTic, I think that's like just a desperation move. Like obviously it worked out really well and it shifted what the league probably would have been had they not made that move. But like obviously like they were dead in the water. They weren't going to be competitive champs most likely if they didn't.
They almost didn't even make champs.
Yeah, like that would have been pretty funny in its own right. But like, so they needed to do something. Whereas you could always make the argument like, hey, if like we stick it out, like our chemistry is just going to be better, and we're going to be able to get over these this hump and whatever troubles we're having. But yeah, I think that's why it's analogous to the United FaZe thing. But even then, like I was looking it up because I knew that it wasn't like too late in the season when they did that, because I think like Anaheim, or I thought that Anaheim was like the event that they attended after, but it looks like it was after the stage 1 playoffs in 2017 is when they made that trade. And then obviously they had the stage 2 playoffs. So like, that they had like, I think quite a bit of time to deal with that, and then they went to champs, and I don't think it was particularly successful for either one of them. And obviously we know that it didn't work out for United until 2 years later when they bring in Simp, and Simp was kind of like that mid-season pickup where he kind of changed everything in the trajectory of that team, and they win the stage 2 playoffs and champs, and breaks Clayster's drought and all of that. I don't know if anybody has like the similar kind of drought, certainly not as high profile in this current CDL era, but yeah, I think there was good reason why we changed our power rankings, and we actually looked at them one more time before the final week of Major 4 qualifiers and before Major 4. I do want to run through the standings real quick before we go into the matches. I know you kind of pointed them out because I think they're obviously very important for seeding. This has been one of the more unpredictable qualifier sets that we've seen, because OpTic is, because of last week, not ideal where they are. We don't know if Miami is going to make it into the winners bracket. Honestly, FaZe might not make it in the winners bracket, so there's a lot of reasons to be interested. Again, we ran through them at the end of last episode, but the standings as they are right now, you have a tie for first place with the Falcons and LAT. Both of them are 3-0. Boston is in third place at 3-1. Then you have G2 Minnesota in fourth at 2-1. Then you have 3 teams tied for fifth place. That's OpTic, Paris, and Carolina. FaZe and Miami and Toronto are all tied for 8th place at 1-2. And then at the bottom, there's a tie at 11th place, and that's C9 and the Vancouver Surge. Let's go into these matches then. Major 4, Week 3, the final week of online Call of Duty of the season. Friday, June 19th, starting off with Falcons versus FaZe. This is one of the matches that you talked about. Like, we do get to see where the Falcons are. We saw the last time that these teams played on LAN in the group stage of Major 3 that the Falcons won. Falcons were the top team of that group, which was very surprising, not something that we certainly expected. I will go with FaZe over the Falcons. I think if we're doing these power rankings and we're going against the power rankings immediately, it is very hypocritical. I think that FaZe is the better team. They have not shown up nearly as consistently as the Falcons have recently, but who knows head to head in this online format if that'll change.
Yeah, I got to go with FaZe too. I think this is a very important week for it. It is a big week for FaZe, just in the sense of them being 1 and 2 in the standings. So to guarantee a winners bracket spot, they need to go 2-0. If they win one match, they have at the mercy of some tiebreakers. And if they go 0-2, they're starting the losers bracket, and then things are getting kind of hairy there. So at the same time, it is a big week for Falcons in terms of like establishing themselves. Like a 2-0 performance this week from Falcons would, depending on map count, potentially give them the number 1 overall seed over LAT. Even if because if LAT go 2-0 and Falcons go 2-0, and Falcons just wins one more map than LAT over those 2 series, they lose one fewer map than LAT over those 2 series, Falcons would be ahead of them in the standings for these qualifiers. So I think, especially like you mentioned, the way FaZe have looked online, I wouldn't be surprised if Falcons were able to win this match, but I still think FaZe is the better team right now, and I got to stick with them.
I think, if the Falcons go 2-0, we might be sipping some Kool-Aid for the Falcons going into Major 4 because, I mean, they would be two pretty good wins. Not like it's not like they'd be beating OpTic and LAT in the same week, but it would be pretty solid for the Falcons to have that kind of momentum going into the Major. Next match we have LAT versus C9. Going to go with LAT.
Yeah.
And then the final match of Friday could be interesting, depending on which Boston Breach and which Gentlemates show up. It is Paris versus Boston. Boston is 3-1 in these qualifiers. They have looked much different over the past few weeks. I'm still going to go with the Gentlemates because that's a ridiculous thing. But I'm very interested. If Boston does win this and they're 4-1 in the qualifiers, how do you feel about them going into Major 4?
I feel the same way as I outlined earlier. I think that they're playing with nothing to lose. This is their champs at Major 4 because they're not going to be at actual champs. Like they have to be viewing it as that opportunity to be like, okay, we got to go hard. Maybe some of these teams like are saving some stuff for champs or whatever, and Boston's just gonna do whatever they can to make as much money as they can, and try and set themselves up for success at EWC too. But I think Gentlemates should win this match regardless of the standings. Just Gentlemates is a more talented team, and I think they should win this one, but I guess this may be more interesting than some people may have considered just on paper.
Saturday, June 20th, starting off with Miami versus C9. I'll go with the Heretics.
Gotta go with Miami. Definitely will be telling. We hit on it last episode at the end there. Miami has a very easy schedule on paper, but it'll still, and I think it could be sort of what you said, like Miami could go 2-0 this week online, and that could cloud some people's judgments or have them a little hyped up in terms of their performance heading into Major 4, but we still got to see them on land. I can't pick Cloud9 over them, but I just had to, set the record straight on that sense of, still got to see more from Miami, but definitely a match here they should win.
Yeah, if they don't go 2-0, then we're having like pretty pessimistic conversations about Miami.
But they just lost to Vancouver. So.
Yeah, I know. Like if they lose again to Vancouver, it's like one time, all right, like, it's kind of like OpTic. If they lose to Carolina, all right, like one time, it's not the end of the world, but 2 times is like becoming a pattern, and that's something to consider. It's honestly the same way with FaZe in Miami. Like, all right, like you can't do it 4 times and us not expect to like notice and comment and actually start to think differently about you as a team. But I very much hope for Miami's sake that they're able to at least beat C9. And maybe Vancouver they lose to, and I might be able to like have some semblance of hope and optimism for them, but certainly not if they lose to the Cloud9. Vancouver versus LAT is the next match. Obviously going to go with LAT.
Yep.
This would be some real shit if LAT didn't finish out this regular season undefeated because
they got the same schedule as Miami.
Yeah, so like that, I don't know how that really worked out that way, but yeah, it can't happen. They can't lose these 2 matches. It just would be so ridiculous to end their 11 match winning streak against either C9 or Vancouver. Toronto versus OpTic is up next, which obviously if this was the pre-roster change Toronto, I think it would be a very interesting match to kind of see where the Koi are, but I'll go with OpTic here.
Yeah, I got to take OpTic.
And then the last match on Saturday is the Falcons versus G2. Again, like I said, if Falcons are able to go 2-0, beating FaZe and G2, both of those teams are not like top of the line as we've outlined earlier this season or earlier this show, but they are certainly good enough where it might be instrumental in like making the case that the Falcons are different than they were previously. I will go with the Falcons over G2. Again, like I made the case like for G2 is like they're gonna have to. They have a lot more to like kind of shed of their reputation a little bit more than the Falcons because the Falcons were actually doing it at Major 3. So I will go with Riyadh here.
Yep, I think this is the most interesting match of the weekend for me personally. I think Falcons versus FaZe um, is right up there too. Obviously, that involves Falcons in both of these, but I think this one is just more so of trying to establish where each of these two teams are, and I think this will be a good gauge, especially because I had them together in that same tier of the power rankings. So I really could see this going either way, and I think this is the only match we're gonna have different out of all of them this week. So I'll go with G2. Me picking Minnesota most likely means they're going to get 3-0 swept in 20 minutes, but then that's what we'll go with.
And then Sunday, June 21st, final day of online Call of Duty, Vancouver versus Miami to start. I will go with the Heretics.
Yep.
Toronto versus G2. I will go with G2 Minnesota. Although I could see Toronto actually winning this match, but like they haven't proven that. It's just kind of a hunch.
Yeah, I'm going with G2 too. I kind of brushed off that last one, but we mentioned before that, Vancouver did just beat this Miami roster in the first match since Real was reinserted into the lineup. So that first match on Sunday will be interesting. I still think Miami should win if they are, playing better of late, but that's still to be determined. So I kind of brushed that off, and I shouldn't have just not said anything for that first match. So I guess that is a little more interesting than some people might anticipate on paper. But yeah, for Toronto and G2, I think Toronto has no shot based on how they've played of late. But at the same time, I am picking Minnesota to go 2-0, so that most likely means they'll go 0-2.
And then last match of the weekend and of the online portion of the season is FaZe versus Carolina. Of course I'll go with FaZe, but
yeah.
Carolina, like I've said the last few weeks, they need literally almost every win from here on out. They need their wins this weekend. They need to make a really deep run at Major 4 to have a shot, and that's kind of assuming that the 6 through 8 teams that they really don't do anything and don't earn any CDL points. I think they're 50, 60 points behind in the season standings. So, they have to make a really deep, championship Sunday type run, which, we've seen in the past. NYSL, a few years ago was able to make that run. And I think they got second at the final major and they made champs as a result. They don't have Crim 6 on this team. So I just don't know or Hydra. So I don't know if that's going to really work out for them. So I will go FaZe.
Yeah, I'm going to go with FaZe too, but I am slightly worried about this match. I think this match being the last match, and not only the last match of the qualifiers, but the last online match of the year, is very fitting in my eyes. I know we usually joke about how the league doesn't always have bangers at the end, but in a very magnified sense, Carolina at points this year were one of the best teams online, didn't have a ton of success on LAN, and FaZe is the exact opposite. They've been one of the worst teams online, and saying one of the worst is harsh, but they haven't been as good online as they have been on LAN this year. The opposite is true for Carolina. I could see Carolina winning this match and it just be we literally saw it. I'm pretty sure Major 1, and obviously different roster. That was the honeymoon phase for Carolina, but Carolina beat LAT in their last qualifier match, I believe, for the Major 1 qualifiers, and then they played each other in the first round of the winners bracket at Major 1, and LAT smoked them. So I wouldn't be surprised if something similar happened here, where Carolina beat FaZe online, and then FaZe plays Carolina at Major 4 and then smokes them. But that being said, I do think, yes, I'm taking FaZe, but this is a match. I could see something funky happening here, especially last online match of the year. Carolina in a do or die situation. And it sounds crazy to even say it out loud, but I wouldn't be shocked if Carolina somehow won this match. I feel like it could happen, but I still just, FaZe is the better team, so I gotta take them.
So you get 10 points for your qualifier wins. For major placings, you get 100 points for first, 75 for second, 60 for third, 45 for fourth, so on and so forth. Currently, Carolina is 60 points back from 8th place, which is the Miami Heretics. Miami plays 2 matches instead of 1 this weekend, and Miami, like we mentioned, play 2 of the worst teams in the league. So if Miami, just for the sake of argument, were to win both of those matches, they would have 230 points and would be 80 points ahead of Carolina. At this point, Carolina would then need to win to be 70 points back of 8th place, and then they'd have to get second at Major 4 to get 75 points, which would put them 5 points ahead of Miami, assuming that Miami doesn't get any points at all at Major 4. I guess you could also say that G2, like if they don't win anything, they would be at 220, so they would only need like 60 points to catch G2, but then they would still need to get 3rd place and G2 not to get any points at Major 4 to even force a tiebreaker, which I would assume that Carolina would lose a tiebreaker with G2, but again, like I don't know, like I would assume head-to-head is how they do the tiebreakers. Right? Like I don't even remember how many tiebreakers we've had with champs and like it being like 2 teams instead of 3 teams, but like I don't think that Carolina would have a tiebreaker with G2 Minnesota. So like again, like Carolina needs to win this match, or certainly would like to, and needs Miami to kind of have the worst week ever this week and lose to 2 bottom tier teams, and then Carolina would need to go to Major 4 and have a run to even have a remote shot at making it into champs. I don't think any of that is really going to happen. I think Miami's probably going to go 2-0. Carolina's probably going to lose this match, and then like as soon as Carolina loses 1 match at Major 4, I think we're gonna be like, all right, like we know exactly which teams are going to champs, and it's just about seeding at that point. But sometimes we don't get the NYSL run where we're kind of like crunching the numbers to see who actually can make it to champs and how different things could be if one match changes or whatever. But I just don't think that's going to happen this season. Either way, pick'em so far this year, you are 167 and 81 on the season, and I'm 165 and 83. Tremor is still winless on the year. We won't be doing a show this weekend, as we said on the last episode. I think we're tentatively looking at maybe doing it on Tuesday, and kind of combining that, both like the final Major 4 qualifiers and reflecting on that, and then also previewing Major 4 and doing a combination show. I think we did that potentially for Major 3 or Major 2. So that tentatively is scheduled for Tuesday like afternoon. We'll do the live show, and then the podcast will be up on Wednesday. The Major starts on Friday afternoon, so that would give you guys a few days to watch or listen to that episode. What do you have?
I was just going to say, I just thought about it for the first time because we always, we haven't had these European events, but, going to have to set those alarm clocks if you're an NA viewer because, I don't know, starts at 3 p.m. I don't know, this might not be right.
Maybe that's local time?
Oh, no, that's the qualifiers. It's qualifiers.
Okay.
The match schedule isn't posted on the CDL yet.
Yeah, I would assume that it'll be 9, 10 a.m. our time. So, I forgot about that. So, Friday morning is when the matches will likely start for anybody in North America. But either way, like that would give us a few days to kind of sink in with all of our predictions. I'm sure, really it's only like 2 teams that I think that are going to have a shot to win it. Like in terms of our predictions, there's probably a lot of teams that actually could win. But our predictions are usually pretty conservative, all things considered. But again, shooting for Tuesday afternoon to do the live show, and then Wednesday for the podcast. Please like, subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. You can watch all of the live streams and all of the VODs for every show that we've ever done, except the very first one, which we did not record. But everything else is on YouTube. You can also watch the live stream or some of the VODs on Twitch as well. Follow and subscribe subscribe at twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2Ks. You can follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcasters at Ego Chall Podcast. And I think that about does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all support. I am kind of shocked we went over an hour here, but we did a good amount of yapping during the power ranking segment. But yeah, one final week of online matches that's over with, and then we got Major 4, Champs, EWC, and then it's back to Roster Mania. So season's very quickly winding to an end here, but the some of the best stuff of the season is still ahead. So exciting time to be a Call of Duty esports fan, and I hope you guys will join us on this journey for the rest of the season. So thank you guys as always. We will see you on the next one, and remember to send the chow.